Please welcome Professor Stephen Kotkin. Hello, Stephen, you there?
Yes, Colin, great to see you.
Hello, my friend. You're in New York City?
Yes, I'm glad to see that Connexus Financial is a sustainable organization.
Well, thank you very much.
You have been through everything and you're still here.
Indeed, my friend, and thank you for your help in that. We've got a little bit going on in the US, huh? And a little bit going on in New York as well. 6 months ago, when we had you speak in June, we were all anticipating a little virus would be probably out of the way by now and would calmly move towards an election that would have had, well, who knows what might have happened. But what's happened since is quite indescribable, Stephen. But look, I've got a number of prepared questions here for you. This session is really to look at, what is sustainability, if not the ability to exist into the future. So in this context, what is sustainability for our institutions, our organisations, our communities, and of course, politics? What will that look like well into the future? And as Professor of History and International Affairs at Princeton, you're in a good position to give us a few little clues and insights. So the first question is, Stephen, let's unpack sustainability. What actually does it look like in the context that is described?
Sustainability achieved a great deal as a concept, predominantly related to the environment, around issues of climate change, obviously, as you've demonstrated again with your conference. But the key to achieving sustainability is always political. And so we need a sustainable politics and especially a sustainable globalization. So I would answer your question with two paradoxes, kind of double paradox answer here. The first paradox is the professor yesterday, our Nobel Prize laureate, Professor Nordhaus, he stated that the current approach to the climate question is failing. Carbon emissions are not declining. The numbers do not lie. So what's the solution? Is the solution more exhortation? Is it more calls for people to sign or read principles? France, as we know, did not implement the Paris Accords. So we're in a cul-de-sac. At the same time, many other people at your conference, and here's the paradox, they talked about how it's working, how their organizations are using all of these principles and implementing them to good effect. So on the one hand, it's a failure. On the other hand, it's working. So that's the first paradox. How do we reconcile this? And the answer is both are true at the same time. It's failing and it's succeeding. The failure is real. It's deeply rooted. People talk about wind. They talk about solar. Wind and solar have been accounting for only the increase in demand. Hydrocarbons have not been displaced, and they are still above 80% of global energy supply. And so right now, the only scalable alternative to hydrocarbons is actually nuclear. And that's because the electric grid is 20th century. So yes, the price of wind comes down, the price of solar comes down, but the electric grid hasn't changed. And the current electric grid is not a 21st century smart grid. Big agribusiness still dominates the food supply. Commercial real estate is still lit all night, 24/7, even though there's actually nobody in the offices. Energy regimes do not change quickly. So one of the problems has been the portrayal of apocalypse. Apocalyptic portrayals have failed in the sustainable politics I'm trying to talk about here. Advocates think that apocalyptic portrayals galvanize action. Well, they galvanize those who are already galvanized. Apocalyptic approaches actually paralyze people or they turn people off. Why has ESG been adopted? Because everyone is a liberal? No. ESG has been adopted because it brings about better returns. Companies that practice ESG perform better. They earn more. They grow faster. They have fewer problems. And so the data show that ESG adoption is not about being virtuous. It's about superior returns. So if you take that approach and you go towards sustainable politics, we need a new tactics. Away from existential language, away from apocalypse, to a cost-benefit language. And we need to be realistic about the costs. We hear a lot about the costs of inaction. We hear much less about the costs of action around sustainability. And it cannot be a trade-off. It has to be a benefit, just like ESG. It can't be about doing the right thing and getting lower returns. It has to be about doing the right thing and getting better returns, greater growth, more jobs, greater wealth, greater well-being. So not apocalypse, but superior economic performance, right? Look at the survey you did about all the people who said they'd like to adopt this, but there are political differences within their organization. Well, imagine that the whole society, because it's not just organizations, but whole societies have these political differences, and that's not going away. So policy success, sustainable politics, is about building ever larger coalitions, and it's about changing incentives, right? Success does not come from shaming people. Success does not come from virtual signaling. Everybody, when they're surveyed now, says they want to be green. If you also ask them, do they want to lose weight? They would also say, yes, they want to lose weight. But of course, if you ask them, do you want to make the following choices in order to lose weight? They say no. So when the green surveys get into the nitty-gritty details about the trade-offs, about the costs of action, not the costs of inaction, the surveys go way down. So that's where the sustainable politics concept comes in, right? You build a consensus. You don't shame people. You don't get people to sign pledges that they're not going to fulfill, like weight loss resolutions. You offer solutions whose costs are bearable and realistic, and whose benefits are widespread and well understood. So you actually have to build from the ground up, and you have to build patiently. And so in the sense that the professor was correct, Professor Nordhaus, that it's failing, the Paris Accords approach, the apocalyptic approach is failing. And at the same time, the introduction of the principles inside organizations and by investors is succeeding. That's the key. That's the answer to the sustainable politics writ large. So that's my first paradox. I have a second paradox, which opens up the sustainability concept even more. So Professor Nordhaus, give him credit. He admits that the current approach is failing. He's been an advocate of the current approach, and he admits it's failing. You have to love that kind of integrity. He's a man of data. He's a man of science, right? At the same time, the second paradox is he wants an even more ambitious version of the current approach that's failing. He says that the Paris Accords are not working because they don't have enough carrots and they have no sticks. So he wants an international agreement which has more carrots and a lot more sticks. And so let's imagine that somehow magically every country signs on to such an agreement. I don't think that's going to happen, but for purposes of discussion, let's imagine magically that that happens. Who actually enforces the implementation? Where is the sustainable politics at the implementation level of such an agreement if, in a fantasy, you can get countries to sign on? For Professor Nordhaus, the data are so bad on CO2 emissions that the international agreement must happen. It absolutely must happen. But of course, if you look at sustainability in terms of politics, not just in terms of the climate, you see that it's very unlikely that it can happen and that it can't really be enforced. And so what's sustainable globalization? Not just sustainable political organizations, but sustainable globalization, right? Global integration requires solidarity. If you don't have solidarity, it's going to be very fragile and it's going to come apart. So we don't have global solidarity. Solidarity is either at the national level or it doesn't exist. Cosmopolitanism is always a minority ideology, always a minority worldview. People are global citizens only in a small way. People are national citizens. Moreover, the governments are accountable nationally. The Australian government is accountable to Australian voters. The American government is accountable to American voters. So we need a globalization, we need a global integration that works nationally, that national publics can hold their governments accountable, right? Policy is national, it's not global. Global policy is an aspiration, but where does global policy actually happen? It happens with your international investors. It happens with your multinational corporations like Coca-Cola, right? Private companies are driven by consumer behavior. They're driven by consumer preferences, and they can act globally because they're all over the world, the big ones. And so this is where you get global politics. You don't get global politics that succeed and are sustainable at the level of the Paris Accords. But you can have companies like Coca-Cola or investors like CalPERS or like the Dutch pension funds or like the Australian supers that implement these principles in their organizations and in their investment practice. So that's my second paradox. My second paradox is you can't have more of the failure to get to success. You need to have more of the success to get to the success, and that's fragmentary, that's organization by organization, and to the extent that there's a political story there, it's national rather than global. So although I've simplified things a little bit, I've tried to capture the two directions of the conference so far. That is to say, the apocalyptic story where the approaches are not working, and then the fantastic success of all the amazing people you've had who've represented organizations and investors and have done such great things.
Thank you, Stephen. That's clear. It does sound, though, to me a little bit that you're now suggesting that this is a private enterprise solution to what we've now had as globally failed governments cooperating, particularly under your current administration.
So once again, politics is national to be sustainable. You can only hold governments accountable at the national level. We can't vote out the global government because there is no global government. We can, however, vote in or vote out politicians at the national level. So we tend to think that the national level is insufficient and that we have to do everything on the global level. But since you cannot do as much on the global level, you do have to focus politically on the national level. Colin, let's take the lockdown story. We've all now been living through the total lockdowns. What have we discovered about total lockdowns? Well, they impose very, very high costs, and that we need to be smarter. There are smarter ways of reducing the pandemic spread than total lockdown, more targeted lockdown rather than total lockdown. And so what you see politically is you need to build a consensus and you need to obtain voluntary compliance, right? Not just coercion, voluntary compliance. And you need to have a smarter lockdown where the costs are not as great. The costs make more sense to people. And so people will comply voluntarily. I'm talking about the same kind of politics around sustainability. To show that we understand the costs of action, not just the costs of inaction. To show that there are benefits, but the benefits are widespread and pervasive. They're not imposed far much greater on one group as opposed to another group, right? The people imposing the lockdowns, for the most part, work from home and have continued to get their salaries. Whereas the vast majority of people experiencing the costs of the lockdowns, who have not been consulted on the lockdowns, they are experiencing the cost because they can't work from home. They own small businesses, for example, or whatever it might be. And so we're not talking only a private sector solution. The private sector is 75 to 90% of the solution. And the 10% to 25% of the solution has to be predominantly built around a sustainable politics where people can be held accountable and where the costs of action are discussed and we build consensus rather than shaming people and virtue signaling. I think that's a clear cut and non controversial way to understand what's come out of this excellent conference.
Thank you, Stephen. If you would like to ask Professor Kotkin a question, this is your opportunity to send it through now. Stephen, the SDG number 16 I mentioned earlier, it's peace, justice, and strong institutions, much of what you're referring to here. When we look at China right now, the US right now, and certainly Belarus, you'd have to suggest there is some major challenge to that sustainable development goal making strong progress, given that these are goals to be complete in 10 years. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would. I would agree, but let's look at how the pandemic is playing out in the authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes love crises. The bigger the crisis, the more they can justify their lack of accountability and their dictatorial power. But they only love crises that they can manufacture. They only love enemies that are invented. They don't actually like real crises. Real crises require governance, require solutions, require adaptability, require accountability, require the free flow of information. So authoritarian regimes have not done as well in the pandemic as we think they have. On the contrary, they're great when the enemy is invented. They're great when they can manufacture the crisis. They're not as great when the crisis requires that they show flexibility, adaptability, accountability, right, and good governance. And so, once again, if you can't get a global solution, the answer is not to keep trying for a global solution. The answer is to solve the problems, to solve the challenges, to increase your performance where you can. Just like Coca-Cola was talking about, just like all the pension fund investors were talking about, just like your money managers were talking about, they're all doing this. And if they said, well, China's not going to comply. China is investing in green, but it's also investing in hydrocarbons. And so therefore, you throw up your hands and do nothing. That's obviously the wrong approach because you build patiently. Energy systems don't change overnight. The hydrocarbon energy system didn't one day appear overnight. It took a really long time for hydrocarbons to become the dominant energy system. And it's taking a while for them not to become. So I wouldn't want to say that just because we see Belarus and China and others, that goal is unreachable. But at the same time, Colin, the principles need to be based on data. Let's take America for a second, if you wouldn't mind, because I know you want to get to America. So the black middle class since the 1970s has doubled. The black upper class since the 1970s has quadrupled. The number of black PhDs, law degrees, master's degrees has tripled since only 1995. The number of blacks with college degrees has gone from 11% to 24%. If you look at the salaries, the income increases of the black population in the United States since the 1970s, it's been phenomenal. I could go through all the statistics. And so does this mean that problems are solved? No. But the idea that we're back to where we were in Jim Crow is obviously a completely false portrayal of the situation. And so when we deal with the aims and goals and aspirations, they need to be based upon data, not based on television images, on Twitter, right? The polarization industry is, of course, going to play up the violence. They're going to play up the discrimination and the racism. They're going to play up real problems, but they're going to make those problems much greater percentage-wise than they are in reality. So let's tackle these issues, but let's tackle them with data.
I'd like to challenge that subject a little bit, but we're almost out of time. I'm going to go to one of the questioners, which is Todd Rupert, who is the chair of the INSEAD Business School Endowment. He says, Professor, renewables won't solve the problem. You mentioned nuclear as a clean possibility. Done safely, the cost benefit is positive. Your view?
He's absolutely right. The issue for nuclear, Todd, as you know, is of course the waste when nuclear is done. But that's a technological problem that can be solved. Colin, we're on the verge of a biotech revolution here, where a lot of the problems are going to be redefined. If you look at, for example, agriculture, many things can be grown not using soil now. If you look at, for example, 3D printing, that's going to change potentially global trade and, of course, the carbon footprint and air travel and everything else. If you look at healthcare, biotech has already revolutionized healthcare with gene intervention, with intervention at the DNA level. So there are many things that are changing, but there are some things that are not changing, and what's not changing is the nature of the grid. The electric grid that we have is a grid in which scalable nuclear makes sense. If we had a different electric grid and batteries were different, then my answer to Todd would be perhaps wind and solar or hydrogen would be more scalable.
So, Stephen, in the preparation for this call, you made a fairly tough assertion of our core audience, institutional asset owners, and that is that their expertise in many things is now largely dead, such as real estate and commodities, and that the next economy is something that they perhaps aren't as well equipped for as they could be or should be. Can you elaborate, please?
So back to sustainability, organizations must be sustainable, right? They must be Sustainability is about adaptability, adaptability to change, adaptability to unforeseen circumstances, and it's about the future. It's about being able to manage the future when it hits you in the face. And so what we see is legacy issues. We see large commitments that made sense. For example, expertise in commodities, expertise in real estate. Those made sense. Those were important asset classes. If you wanted to reach your returns, you had to understand those asset classes. Are those going to be the asset classes you need as an organization to understand 5 years from now? It's hard to say, but potentially no. And so how do you go as an organization from the legacies that you inherit and you've invested in expertise-wise versus the expertise you're going to need tomorrow or the day after tomorrow? And so for an organization, it's not easy because you're talking about people. You're talking about people, their livelihoods. You're talking about retraining. You're talking about hiring new people, but maybe not firing the ones you have. So there's a major transition that's required for organizations, including institutional investors, to be sustainable, but they know that better than I do.
Stephen, we're almost out of time, but another quick question from our audience. In a highly non-cooperative environment, cooperative strategies yield the highest payoffs. What might be your ideas to achieve mutually beneficial solutions?
So once again, it's always about the middle and building out from the middle and the highest common denominator, right? Companies succeed because they provide products that the majority of people will buy. In other words, they don't succeed as well if they sell only niche products. Yes, niche products can win, but the biggest global companies sell to the middle. They sell to the tastes that are the most widespread. Same thing with politics. You build out a coalition from the middle. You need the center left and you need the center right. If you have the center left and the center right, you can add elements from the far left and the far right. You can salami them off. If you build from the far left and you build from the far right, you're a minoritarian view and you can only win through manipulation, which is not sustainable.
Thank you to Patrick Chew, who's been a very regular questioner, both in yesterday's sessions and today. He's from Hester Super Fund, so he's awake very late. A Melbourne headquartered fund, and it's 20 past midnight. So well done, Patrick. His question is, if we focused on local solutions, will there be a risk that the burden is being shared inequitably?
Yes, there will be. Patrick is shrewd again on this. But once again, you just had a presentation prior to me about nonlinear change and about how one thing can trip a whole lot of other things which we don't understand because they're all related in a system. So the behavior of one group, one organization, one company looks like they're bearing burdens that others are not, but their behavior can trip others. And others can be forced to fall in line or can be left behind. That was the argument of several of the people who made presentations, including the previous one, as I just alluded to. So Patrick is right, but it's the same thing with a protest or a demonstration, Colin. The bravest people go first, and then the other people who are less brave, they see that it can be done. They see that, you know what, we can go out on the streets of Belarus or wherever it might be, and we can do this protest. If the bravest people didn't start, the people who are not quite as brave wouldn't see that it's possible, and they wouldn't be tripped or triggered into coming out. So Patrick, you're right, but Patrick, please go ahead and do it, and others will follow your example, be challenged by you, be worried, fearing that they'll be left behind.
So, Stephen, next year join us for the global conference. It'll be the Fiduciary Investor Symposium, December 8 and 9, and that will be just after 4 weeks from a election in your country. The election may be a Trump return, it could be a Biden, or on that December 8 and 9, some 4 weeks later, it could be in dispute and unclear. What's your prediction? And does it make any difference to the future of America?
It makes a big difference to the future of America. Once again, we need to build out from the middle. The polarization industry, the divisive politics hit a wall, as anybody could have predicted. And we need an inclusive politics, a politics of left of center, right of center, finding deals together. You know, right now we have Biden up in the national polls. Everyone understands, having seen 2016, that we don't have a national election. We have an electoral college. So if Biden wins more votes in California than Hillary Clinton, she won by 3 million in California. If Biden wins by 5 million in California, he still only receives the same number of electoral votes. So a 7% victory or a 5% or a 3% victory nationally doesn't mean much. It's all about those electoral college swing states. There, the polls are only just beginning. They're very primitive. They start later than the national polls. We need better swing state polls. I would advise your listeners to pay attention to the difference between polls of registered voters and polls of likely voters. Polls of likely voters are much more important because turnout determines outcome. Polls of registered voters don't mean nearly as much. What we're seeing in the swing state polls is they're within the margin of error, and they're mostly likely registered rather than likely. So we need more data yet to see where the election is going. And of course, we have the 3 debates coming up. And of course, as you mentioned, we have the possibility for chaos in the electoral response. I'm more confident than most people, however, that the institutions are stronger than we say. They're stronger than Twitter predicts. They're stronger than cable news predicts. And that the American people are more sensible than the Twitter, cable news, polarization industry portrays them to be. So while I can't be optimistic, I think the pessimism is overdone.
Professor Kotkin, we are out of time. As always, you've illuminated many great thoughts and ideas to our audience. Thank you for your generosity and being a great friend of Connexus Financial over this past 9 years. We'll see you again very soon. Stay safe and well in New York. Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.